Welcome to Eclecticist. Eclecticist is an investigation of everything, one topic at a time. Our discussion is from a very British perspective by two brothers who consider themselves to be relatively normal chaps. We typically choose a topic of interest, we spend a little bit of time researching it, reading around it, we have a discussion, and afterwards we publish the notes. We are Benjamin de Campos, a designer and believer, Jeffrey Campos, me, an engineer, and godless and wicked. The main benefits are the fostering of a greater understanding of the world before we die, and hopefully to prompt further thought and discussion from our listeners. Today, our topic, we will be discussing Michael Jackson, the King of Pop.
At one time, in virtually every walk of life, the name Michael Jackson was synonymous with pop, superstar, band-aids. As is so often the way with these mega global icons, it didn't take long for the extravagant not-of-this-world façade to slip and make fertile soil for scrutiny every bit as extreme as the strange creature himself. You see what I did there? It's all too easy to forget that Michael Jackson was a human being. What's also seemingly easy to forget is just how talented he was. Just compare the two kings. Jackson was a songwriter that actually wrote all his biggest hits. Elvis Presley didn't write anything. Jackson also invented the phrase sho-mo. Both men, however, were white, went weird, and died prematurely. Michael Jackson, bad?
We're certainly not going to talk about shoes for cats in this topic, just thought I'd let you know. So, Michael Jackson, he was human, and he was born in 1958. No earlier or no later, in Gary, Indiana, apparently. And he was brought up in a very large family. I believe he had 8 siblings in a very small house. And as a Jehovah's Witness, which I find quite interesting. And he continued to be a practicing Jehovah's Witness for quite some time. There's a lot of abuse and violence in his family history, it would seem. So he had a bit of a rocky upbringing. But his talent shone through. I think it was all about his talent and the way in which he used his talent in order to sort of rail against the abuse and violence and lack of love and lack of childhood in his early upbringing. And I think generally from what I've been reading, I think the general feel for the psychology of Michael Jackson is that he was fighting against his perceived lack of childhood, and he was doing that by living a sort of self-absorbed, childish lifestyle. What do you think about his upbringing? Is it all about his upbringing? Does it all of his behavior, is it all found in his early childhood?
I think you could make a case that the abuse had something to do with it. I mean, not everything to do with it. I mean, of course not. But he was subject to abuse by his father. And, as is so often the way with parents who push their kids to extremes, they're pushed to breaking point. Some of them. I mean, possibly Jackson more than the others. I mean, he may have been the most talented and possibly having the most potential. I mean, Jackson has gone on record on this. He's discussed some of the abuse. I mean, maybe you can talk about that. But what I recall was him recounting how his dad used to make him feel self-conscious about his nose. And of course, that had some pretty profound effect on him.
Mm. Indeed. I mean, in the reading around Michael Jackson for this topic, I didn't find any evidence of family violence before Michael Jackson. So I couldn't find any accounts by his older siblings on whether or not they were particularly targeted by their father. It definitely seemed as though there was a real swelling of violence when Michael Jackson came along. So much so that one of his brothers suggested that the reason why he was such a great dancer is because all of the innovative moves he had to invent in order to dodge his father's swinging rods. Although evidently, according to his father, he was never beaten by rods or sticks. It was usually belts. But even so, it was open violence in the family, and this was witnessed by all of Michael Jackson's siblings. and certainly he ruled the family. This is their father, Joe, ruled the family with an iron rod, indeed, and did make things happen. I mean, really motivated them to practice their musical skills, to build the band, really push them to become inevitably the first all black boy band ever. Apparently, the Jackson Five, and certainly didn't take very long at all for them to identify Michael Jackson as the real talent of the group and to push him into the front. I think he was 11 years old when he was leading the band, and their father was always there to keep them in line, and he did. So good thing. It's hard to say, but certainly he was a very violent man, and I think it would be interesting to ask the questions: would they have achieved their fame had he been a more reasonable person? But it was 1969, their first big breakthrough performance, the Jackson 5, which led to their number one, I Want You Back. All the squeaky voices that come flowing into my mind when I think about it. So that's very early on. You know, he wasn't even a teenager, Michael Jackson. So, you know, you could argue that he lost the greater part of his childhood because of the touring and the fame, and you know, it all came on quite quickly. And certainly they had some real success really early on. I mean, really, it's just been success, major success from such an early age. 1970, they had 3 number ones in 1970. ABC, some dodgy lyrics there, especially from a kid. I'll Be There and The Love You Save. All great songs. I mean, you know, they're listenable now. You know, so that's just absolutely incredible. But of course, there's a real toll on the psychology. And you know, I think if you're a kid and you're working, this is a real strain. It warps your sensibilities and warps your general outlook, as we have seen with so many other child stars. You know, it doesn't end well in all cases, for sure, and it ends really quite badly in a lot of cases, as we've seen, to be thrust into the media spotlight at an early age. I think we'll talk a little bit more about his childhood a little bit later on, but let's just move along to the man himself as a very productive individual. I mean, his general professionalism, the Michael Jackson that we'd like to remember, was amazing. You know, all of the documentaries that I've ever seen about him, all of the articles I've read about Michael Jackson, is that he was a complete and total workaholic. I mean, he just only worked and worked incredibly hard, and he danced longer and harder than any of his dancers. He sang to the point where doctors were advising him to rest his voice, lest he turn mute. And generally speaking, he was massively productive and a workaholic. Do you agree from what you've read?
I don't know about him being a workaholic. I didn't know the man. I mean, but probably. I think people at his level, they probably are workaholics. But he was probably so musically awesome that you couldn't have kept that talent down. You could make an argument that even without the abuse, the pressure and everything, he could still have been successful. As you say, it is a familiar story of artists that achieve so much so early on in their careers that they just burn out or go off the rails in the most crazy ways, which I get. That they're only human beings after all. I mean, what does blanket adoration do to the mind? Being showered with everything on every level.
I think at an early age, if he had positive strokes from his performances, from his family who are generally violent, or didn't provide him with enough attention, well, then he'll continue doing what garners him attention and love from his family, to the absolute extreme. So he lived, and at the same time, he loved to perform, because when he is performing, he is in control. he is in his own little world. That gives him an extra layer of security that he probably can't find in any other part of his life. So he kind of pushes himself into a little pigeonhole, like a trapdoor spider, to mix metaphors. And that was his little bubble of protection. He would perform, he would get plaudits and applause, and then that would become his sort of surrogate loving family. So he continued down that road. And of course, when you do that, you're wearing blinkers through life, and the whole world becomes less conducive to your navigation through it. I think he built this performance jacket around himself because he was forced into it by an unloving family. This is what I've read. This is what I've gleaned from all the articles on the psychology of the man. It was a defense mechanism and a security blanket all at the same time. And yet, all of this was ballooned because of his massive talent. His undisputed talent. He had a great singing voice, a lot of control. He could really move. He had an amazing ability to innovate when it came to dancing. He was appealing, generally speaking. He had it all going for him, really. And he's a musician. I mean, he was musical. He's a musical person. He could write music. He could understand music. He could use music. All around, a massive glowing light of talent. And he was being very violently pushed forward by lots of parties, including his family and his agents and the media in general, thrust in the media spotlight. So he had a lot of motivators to keep going down the route that he was going. But as you say, inevitably, such a velocity, it's inevitable that he'll come off the rails a bit, and I think he did in a lot of different ways. Moving into his performance, so when we think of Michael Jackson and we think of performance, what springs to mind? I mean, I've written here in our notes just his set piece moves. He has all these iconic moves that we can list, and whenever he dances, we can literally tick them off when we see them. The kick and the moonwalk and the robot, his pirouettes and whatnot. But it's not, of course, just his dancing. It's his particular type of voice, which I have to say I was never a fan of. I thought it was a bit watery and a bit warbly, a bit sort of weak. What do you think about his singing voice?
I completely disagree. His voice was very distinctive. There was no one that sounded like Michael Jackson. His tone, the little noises that he makes.
Yeah, I like his little noises that he makes, but I think when he actually sings, it sounds a lot like a nervous warble to me.
Well, that's fine. I personally think it made him sound like Michael Jackson. I mean, there might be people that sounded like him, but it would have been the other way around. Singers who were copying Michael Jackson.
I just always thought it's just kind of a bit too synth poppy for me. But I mean, this is my personal opinion, obviously.
Right.
And there were songs where it's heavy on the singing, and which I did like, despite not particularly liking the sound of his voice. It just seemed very trebly, just like all of his music seems trebly. It just kind of very in a tin can, sort of. I feel like his particular style of music, I can identify his particular style of music like I can identify George Michael's particular style of music and sound. George Michael I think has a very distinctive sound. It sounds like he's in a tin can, and there's lots of reverberation. Every song I've ever heard that he's ever done, I don't know if there's a special effect or not, but it does sound like that to me. And Michael Jackson does have I know it's Michael Jackson, but I also know that it's kind of annoying a little bit. But there's so much that makes up for that, like, the actual melody or whatever's going on at the time. His dancing, so I can tolerate it. Because I'm generally a fan. So there's his voice, which is a good voice, and a distinctive voice. There's his iconic dance moves, He choreographed so much of his music. And he was a complete perfectionist, from what I gather. Everything just had to be absolutely perfect, and he just spent an enormous amount of time torturing his hired dancers to make sure they get it right. And even when you watch his performances, he always seems to be the best. He is not, I suppose, a professionally trained dancer, and yet he seems to be dancing better than all the professionally trained dancers, which I thought was amazing. It's a testament to his dedication. And then there's the music itself. I mean, his music. I mean, I think of Michael Jackson's music as pop music. He's the king of pop, after all. But it's a sort of R&B rock fusion, which was quite new and innovative at the time. It's a sort of there's a lot of the white music scene and the rock music scene that they sort of merged into the super mega popular R&B, even at the time, in the 60s, with a terrific live experience. And, just everybody always reports it to be particularly successful in the smaller circuits and the club scene and all the rest of it. I really sort of center on the 90s period of Michael Jackson. Whenever I try to imagine Michael Jackson, I think of his 90s albums and music and sound. I have to really think hard to think back to the 80s and what his sound was like then. So mostly for me, it's dangerous, and a few of the songs on his History album, which I think was like a best of album, I believe. I have it somewhere. Rather than Off the Wall and Thriller, I tend not to think of those. I tend to watch the videos of those songs rather than listen to the music of them, which I do with Invincible and Dangerous, and much more recent works. But I think he did cover. I say pop music and I say R&B rock fusion, but he did do quite a range of different musical forms, I think. I mean, he did give a lot of different things a go. What do you think? Do you think his music was really samey, or do you think he actually did have a bit of a spectrum?
I think his music is pretty samey. I mean, you and I are coming at this from different angles, because I don't think of the 90s Jackson when I think of Jackson. I think of his very iconic 80s stuff, like Thriller, Beat It, Bad, Moonwalking, that era. And of course, what he looked like then, he was far more wearing a costume in those days, I think. But I generally don't like the sound of his music. I don't like the sound of the 80s music anyway. But the way I listen to music, or the way I try to listen to music, is to strip off the production sheen to get to the songs. And I think there's a reason why he was so successful. He wrote really good songs. Perfectly crafted little masterpieces. And I think had they been performed by a band that I like, then he would have sounded, or the songs would have sounded fantastic. But as I got older, my tastes changed, and I stopped noticing Michael Jackson, and that would have been around the early to mid 90s. I don't really know what happened to Jackson around that time musically, but I think he was in the news a lot. I think that must have been around the time when the allegations of Katie.
Well, that was 1994. Yeah, 93, 94. The charges were in 94. Child molestation charges.
Yeah, I remember when that started. That started to hit the headlines. I remember thinking that I hadn't really thought about Jackson, for a while.
Yeah, I never stopped listening to him. Quite frankly, I kept buying all of his albums and listening to all of them. So, just before all of this child molestation malarkey, he released "Dangerous" in 1991, which I quite liked. I thought there were some great songs in there and some great sounds, and I liked where he was going, and I kept wanting more from him. I can imagine this is a real part of his general malady, in that people just want to have more from him and take from him. But I was sort of willing him to have a huge comeback in the 90s and just really teach us all a lesson and bring out some seriously stellar music. which he failed to deliver. I mean, he sort of nearly got there with Blood on the Dance Floor. I thought, more stuff like this. And I thought that's more forward-looking and more modern sounding. And I thought, I quite like this direction that he's taking, but didn't go very far, unfortunately. And I think that's probably because of all the controversy that he was not enjoying in his life at the time. So I think we can move along on to acting. So again, towards the late 80s, he was in movies. He was a screen actor. He had he was into film and video from a very early age, of course. He was in music videos with the Jackson 5. And then in his solo career, of course, he did the, 13-minute long, 14-minute long short movie Thriller, which was just absolutely immense.
I just early 80s.
That. And it was absolutely huge. And you watch it now, it's just incredible. There doesn't seem to be anything like that even now. It's rare to see something like that. It's absolutely crazy how many barriers it broke, certainly when it came out. And you can say he's an actor as well. I'm sure that's on his CV. And then there was Moonwalker. I don't know if you remember that. I couldn't find in my research. I didn't find very much on this, but Moonwalker was a weird sort of set of music videos, all very loosely connected by some absolutely crazy plot line, and it had some pretty cutting-edge computer graphics in it. It had some interesting photography. I think it had a few different directors and art directors in it. So it's basically a string of music videos, I suppose, knitted together. But it's worth a watch. I mean, it doesn't live very well these days. If you watch it, it's kind of you're going to have to fast forward sequences of it. But I thought it was very interesting. It definitely is worth a watch. There's some good ideas in it and some great music, of course. So he's an actor as well, I suppose. I never saw The Wiz. He played the Scarecrow in The Wiz. I never saw that. Did you see that?
No.
I think he was in the sequel as well, but no idea. I never saw that.
Never
heard
like
a musical comedy version of The Wizard of Oz, which he has said was one of his favorite films of all time, which I watched just the other day, in fact, and it is still amazing. So great voice, obviously a incredible dancer, brilliant musician, composer. He has it all. He has the whole performance package down. He's an absolute born performer, for sure. But of course, along with all that skill and performance comes the media. So the media have always been very interested in him, as they are interested in anybody who's famous or very successful in their field. And I don't think the media have been kind to Michael Jackson, generally speaking, for his entire life. What do you think? Is that a controversial thing to say?
No, I don't think that's a controversial thing. I think that's a correct thing to say. And I think it's something that many artists with that much exposure will inevitably face. When you're at the top, there's only one direction to go, and he was a darling of the media for so long, and I think the media turned on him. They were cheerleading his demise. We love stories about people's stars falling. I wouldn't say the media are to blame for anything particularly.
Was it the media's fault when Michael Jackson dangled one of his children out of a window? Did they push him into that? Was he pressed into this by the media? If the media didn't exist, would he have done that? I don't know when he did this, but it was certainly one of his children. And there was a huge crowd of the press outside of his hotel. And for some completely bizarre, but probably explicable reason, he dangled one of his children out of the window. And it really, I don't know whether it was just a camera angle or not, but it looked really, really unbelievable when you see it. I couldn't believe it when I saw it.
You sound like the media just then, the way you reported on it in such horror.
It was unbelievable. I mean, who honestly, what kind of frame of mind must you be in to stick a child out of a window? I mean, we're not talking the first floor here. Literally, the child was out of the window. These are facts. and that is a lunatic thing to do. A normal person under normal circumstances would not do that. So either he was pressed into very abnormal circumstances by the press, or he just really is a lunatic. So what I'm saying is that surely the media has had a role in pushing him in a direction that is destructive, I would have thought. And yes, I agree that the media do want to see a fireball. They want to see bigger and better all the time. Like Michael Jackson, he wanted to give us bigger and better all the time. He wanted to be bigger and better all the time. He wanted to be, all of it. Better looking, skinnier, better singer, bigger performances, the whole thing. And the media want the same thing. They're just as happy with somebody imploding as they are somebody achieving incredible success. Whatever sells the newspapers, that's the most important thing. And if they can cultivate their own market by pressing somebody in a particular direction that would benefit them, then they're going to do it.
I think they're more happy with someone imploding rather than someone being successful. It's a strange quirk of the hive mind. I don't think the media is to blame for Jackson dangling his child from a balcony. He did it. I think at a push, you could make the case that the media is in some way culpable on some level. But people deal with these things differently, differently to one another. And Jackson's brain is wired in a certain way. And that's how he dealt with the media. Weirdly.
Yeah, it's a funny old relationship. I mean, wasn't it Gore Vidal who said, "It's not enough to achieve success. I need to see other people fail," or words to that effect. So he was a media darling in either direction for sure. I mean, certainly he's one of the most media covered celebrities of all time, and the sheer fact of information that we can access just gives you an idea of how unbelievably well covered his life was by the media. But to leave the media for a few moments and talk about his finances. So he was hugely successful pretty much his whole life. And he earned incredible amounts of revenue for his record labels and all the people with vested interests. And there was still money left over for himself. So I think I read that at his peak, he had a fortune of $270 million net, but that was attached to debts of $330 million. So he was always heavily indebted, but also very rich. So it's one of those peculiar situations. He spent a lot of money on crazy things, ridiculous amounts of extremely overpriced and vulgar furniture and paintings and assorted art relics. He gave a lot of money to charity. He set up charities. He did a lot of work for underprivileged children. Children were a real focus for him insofar as his charitable donations and works. But it's a lot of money. His entire estate was just huge, massive fortunes gathered from his live performances, of which he did many live performances, and his just record sales. I mean, Thriller, the record, I think is still the #1 best-selling record of all time, I think, all things considered. So I think it tops out Pink Floyd and all the other top 10 records. He's still #1, and he'll probably still be #1 for a very long time. I mean, his discography legacy will continue to generate billions of dollars for however long the copyrights are maintained, which I think will probably be indefinitely.
Well, he will be the best-selling artist for all time, forever, because they've changed the rules as to how it all works. So now something can't stay in the charts for longer than 10 years. So Thriller and Dark Side of the Moon and all of that will now be immortalized.
Yeah, it's odd how it all works. And I thought the whole idea of copyright and patents is that they last for as long as it is lucrative to yourself as a human individual, but then it moves to the public domain. But it seems completely dependent on the value of the material, on whether or not extensions to the copyright laws are available. An example that springs to the mind is Disney. Disney plagiarized a whole bunch of traditional stories and then copyrighted them, and now has extended that copyright beyond their original copyright sell-by date. So things like Snow White and Bambi, which should by rights be out of copyright, are still very much in copyright. They somehow are able to get a hold of these copyrights. Weird how it all works. I can't figure it out. But certainly I can imagine Michael Jackson's music is going to be copyrighted until the end of time. So incredibly rich. Money just seemed to drip through his fingers, however. He lived abroad for a while. He moved to Bahrain, so I read. And while he was living in Bahrain, I think his debts mounted exponentially, and it became a real problem. He really fell into a major financial ruin situation. I think his principal property, Neverland Ranch, fell into disrepair, and he didn't have the money for its upkeep, and it started to be... They started thinking whether or not they're going to sell it off, but I think he was able to hang on to it somehow. So it's amazing, someone so unbelievably rich and successful, yet still having financial difficulties. It's bizarre. It reminds me of Robin Williams, who evidently was quite indebted, even though he had multiple homes and, able to generate massive sums of money from his performances, and yet still supporting multiple wives and children and properties seems to drain the coffers somewhat. Religion. So how did Michael Jackson work with religion? Was he a religious man? He was brought up as a Jehovah's Witness, which he continued to partake of, but that sort of dwindled away, and it seemed to have been replaced by his own sense of a messiah complex, perhaps. Was he a religious person? Did he use religion? What do you think?
I don't know. I don't know enough about that side of him. I mean, a lot of popular singers of color, particularly from Jackson's era, tend to have come from a gospel background. I don't know if that's the case with him.
Yeah, I can't think of any gospel sort of sound from him in particular at any point. It really doesn't spring to mind.
Man in the Mirror is kind of gospel-y, I guess. I mean, that's one of the few songs that he didn't actually write, Man in the Mirror. But this brings us on to another thing, a plausible messiah complex. There's a lot of backlash after he appeared somewhat Christ-like at the thing that you said you saw him at.
Oh, yes. This was the Brits. It was the Brit Awards at Earl's Court in 1996. This was when he was... No, I think it was Earl's Court. I don't think he's been to Alexandra Palace. I think the Brit Awards have been to Alexandra Palace, but he has not been to Alexandra Palace. This was famously when... Well, you tell the story. Well, I mean, I was there, and I didn't see much. All I remember is that someone got on the stage and was just running on the stage, and they were pushed off the stage. That was all. Evidently, what happened was that Jarvis Cocker of Pulp got onto the stage and got in the way and then was ejected from the stage. That is all. But the performance that was happening at the time was, from what I remember from a distance, it was Michael Jackson, very brightly lit. It was lots of lighting on the stage, and there were loads of children on the stage, and they were all singing, I guess it was a medley of his songs. And that was all. And definitely, I mean, from what I've subsequently read about it, Michael Jackson was definitely sort of very Christ-like in his portrayal. He was wearing all white, and he had lots of light behind him, and he did a sort of a Christ-like crucifixion pose. I suppose maybe Jarvis Cocker thought that was a little bit too much, or perhaps Jarvis Cocker is particularly religious and took offense. I don't know, and he got on the stage, got in the way. But I think that's the Messiah complex. I think that might have been one of the triggers for the critics there. And there have been other episodes where Michael Jackson has sort of come across as a kind of Christ-like figure with his, I guess, early 90s phase of wearing white and a little captain of the football team black band around his arm. But that's about it, really. I don't really think anywhere else in his career he's particularly alluded to any religious imagery. It doesn't spring to mind. I think, generally speaking, he's sort of modal and thematic. You know, he sort of goes through phases. There was the military, quasi-military phase of, I think, Dangerous. And then there is the sort of anti-authority, quasi-punk phase of Bad. There's a sort of lounge lizard phase of Billie Jean. As close to a lounge lizard phase as he could possibly get. And then there's the sort of hipper, cooler, blood on the dance floor phase, I guess. I sort of see him as...
You're not being
sort of like
chronological,
Madonna.
by the way.
Madonna. No, that
You're
wasn't
going
chronological at
back
all.
in time and then bouncing
That
forward.
that was in no particular order. I was just thinking to my mind what was springing into my mind about his different looks. A lot like Madonna, who was very much a contemporary of his. Madonna and Prince were both born within weeks of Michael Jackson. And Madonna, you know, famously has different genres of her music, completely reinventing herself for whatever the market is. Probably not true for Prince, though, particularly, but he definitely had different sounds at different times, but for different reasons. Michael Jackson and religion, I just don't see that at all. I don't see any link between him and religion, particularly.
I have a quote here of Jarvis speaking about that incident many years later. He says, he was pretending to be Jesus. I'm not religious, but I think as a performer myself, the idea of someone pretending to have the power of healing is just not right, Cocker said. Rock stars have big enough egos without pretending to be Jesus. That was what got my goat, that one particular thing.
Yeah, right. Well, it's a performance. I mean, they're performers. We all know this. I suppose you can take offense, but I mean, certainly I was too far away to really see what was transpiring in the melee, but I didn't see anything particularly outrageous. I just thought it was a performance like anything else.
I'm really surprised you saying this. I mean, I remember watching this on TV. I'm sure it's on YouTube if anyone wants to go and revisit it. And I remember thinking that it was pretty incredible. I mean, like really out there. You know, he had his arms stretched out, you know, like Jesus on the cross, lots of kids. I mean, I totally agree with Cocker.
Yeah, he definitely, I remember him doing something like that, but I mean, I think they edit these things a lot, and really, to get the true story of what actually happened, you'd have to get that from somebody who's sitting, you know, in the front rows, who watched all of it without any editing, and I think all I remember is it looked like somebody got on the stage, started getting in the way, and then were quickly removed. That's what it looked like to me. I forgot about it the second, you know, after it happened. It was a very minor event and didn't really stop anything.
I mean, it's almost 20 years ago, but I remember in the original broadcast, you couldn't see Jarvis Cocker. It was only after everything blew up and they showed it again, but they re-edited it where you could then, you know, see Jarvis and his crazy antics.
Well, they edited, they edited everything. I mean, cutting Jarvis Cocker out would have cut out about 5 seconds.
Yeah, but what you seem to be alleging is that it was like a storm in a teacup, and it was clever editing, and Michael Jackson wasn't really behaving like Christ.
Oh, no, I'm not saying he wasn't behaving like Christ. No, I mean, you know, he probably was. It didn't particularly occur to me at the time. for whatever reason. But I was just watching it.
It sounds like you were sitting at the back, not paying much attention.
Well,
I mean,
no, I
on
was
TV, it was pretty clear.
I was watching with my eyes, watching it, but I wasn't. I mean, I'm not a Christian, so I wasn't being offended or anything. I was just watching. This is some kind of. I mean, I remember particularly that there were a lot of children there, even before his performance. There were a lot of children around, and I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. They're all just standing around in the aisles, in costumes, obviously. And I thought, okay, well, this is part of a performance. But there seemed to be an awful lot of them. And why are they here? And I thought that was peculiar. And when they all started filing onto the stage, and loads of people on the stage, it was like a musical. It reminded me of. There's a musical with a lot of little street urchins in it. Is it Les Miserables? I think that's what it is. It was sort of like that sort of production. And I just viewed it as a production. I was listening to the music and watching the lighting and Michael Jackson. I really don't have that much of a memory of it, but it didn't seem out of the ordinary or anything interesting particularly. But I do remember a disturbance, but it happened in a few seconds. It was over, and some lunatic turned out to be Jarvis Cocker. I mean, I was never a fan of Jarvis Cocker, only because I never listened to his music. It just that he just completely passed me by. So I don't have any thoughts about it particularly at all. But in terms of religion, I just don't see any kind of religious aspect to Michael Jackson apart from his self-apotheosis, perhaps, as forced by the circumstances of his upbringing and his subsequent trajectory.
I think you need to watch it again.
I'll make a point of it.
I mean, it's really not subtle.
Well, no, I'm not denying that. I'm sure it wasn't, but it just didn't affect me at the time. Maybe if I watch it again, I'll go, "Oh my goodness, how dare he?"
It's not a case of how dare he. It's a case of what the hell is wrong with him.
Yeah, but it is a how dare he because somebody got up onto the stage and actually interrupted the performance. So obviously it upset.
You mean how dare he to Jarvis Cocker?
No. It is a case of how dare he to Michael Jackson because somebody obviously was irritated and motivated to disrupt the performance. So clearly it offended someone, and that someone clearly was Jarvis Cocker because he got up onto the stage. You don't generally do that to your peers who are performing at an event, right? That's not the done thing. So clearly he was very offended by that. I'm simply saying I certainly wasn't very offended by that. And, each to their own. But my underlying point here is that I don't see any particular religiosity in Michael Jackson, the man, even allowing for any sort of religious imagery in his performances. Moving away from religion for a second and to philanthropy. So speaking of healing the needy, he definitely did do a lot of works for charity, a lot of good deeds. He was a philanthropist. He did operate a lot of child-specific charities. And he did once pledge, I don't know if he ever carried this out, but he did, well, no, clearly he did not, but he pledged to adopt a couple of children from every country. It's pretty amazing. That's a big pledge, but I don't think that ever transpired. He was attracted to the innocence and purity and vulnerability of children, I think, and youth in general. I think, again, he saw himself in other children, especially children who were being mistreated. And I think that leads us into controversy.
Yes. I think we should segue here. I think he made himself vulnerable to extortion. I think the world is full of unscrupulous sorts who see an opportunity. And I can't help but think that the lawsuits and subsequent settlements were in that category. I mean, personally, I don't think he was a pedophile, but I do think he was a very eccentric / weird, naive guy. And I think his apparent weirdness was there in that infamous slanted documentary by Martin Bashir. The name escapes me. Living with Jackson, something like that. Actually, I think that did Bashir's credibility some harm. Just in terms of not particularly honest journalism, but the the documentary put Jackson in a very unflattering light. And the Jackson estate issued their own documentary rebuttal, if you remember, where Jackson explains his fascination and his friendship with children over adults in some almost rational way, but not quite, which wasn't in the original documentary because it didn't fit with that narrative. But I think the damage was done to Jackson's reputation. I think it was irreparably harmed.
Well, I don't know if it was completely irreparably harmed, because he did make a sort of a comeback, and he's still selling a hell of a lot of new music after the fact, and he had a semi-resurgence. Quite a bit of a resurgence, actually. Yeah, but I mean, for sure, he's a strange fellow, and I certainly felt like the Martin Bashir interviews was a sort of entrapment. You know, it was like
It wasn't
John
entrapment.
DeLorean and the cocaine.
It was just distortion.
Well, I don't know. It was hard to distort the fact that he was sitting in the interview holding hands with a child that wasn't his child. I mean, you know, that's
It's weird.
that's a problem.
I mean, it's weird, but is it?
It is
anything else?
weird. That is weird, but it's explicably weird. It is weird, but I don't think I don't think it's excusably weird. I think it's a problem. I think I understand that he's more at home with children who are unlikely to exploit him directly without coaching, and that he could form friendships with children more meaningfully than he could with anyone else. But nonetheless, his behavior is unacceptable for an adult.
According to you.
And that was it. That was very much exposed by Martin.
Yeah, but you say his behavior is
Bashir.
unacceptable.
But I certainly don't think
Yeah, but according to whom?
that
behavior is
he's any
unacceptable?
kind of. I think, generally speaking, I think it's unacceptable for grown-ups to hold hands with other people's children without the parents of those children present. I think, ask anybody, and I think if you did a straw poll, people would say, yeah, that's fairly unacceptable. But I at the same time, I certainly never thought he was a pedophile. I think he's just childlike. He simply is still a child. He's still waiting to live his childhood. And so, you know, that has morphed into the grotesqueries of his later activities as an adult, from the frustrations he felt as a child. He had very child-specific activities like the Neverland Ranch and his theme park for underprivileged children, and so I think he was definitely a weird dude. Don't think he was a pedophile. I think he was being had over the child molestation allegations, and that was a terrible time for him. That was the darkest period of his life, no doubt. But he managed to recover, at least financially, and in terms of his performances from that. But I think the damage was done, and he was really, really hurtling down the rails towards derailment by that time. And I think that's the time when all the rest of his strange peccadillos came out and were massively reported, like the alteration of his body, for instance. That became a huge point of interest for the media for a long time, for many years. This included the skin lightening. He always defended his lightening skin, not defended it, but he explained the lightening of his skin to a blotchy pigmentation disorder and the treatment thereof.
Vitiligo.
And also, yes, and also he had a lot of plastic surgery. I mean, he definitely had a lot of plastic surgery. He allegedly slept in an oxygen tank. And,
that's crap.
Clearly he had a lot of self-image problems, and they seemed to increase as he got older, and certainly seemed to accelerate after these child molestation allegations, which were settled. He settled out of court on those. So psychologically, he became very much a point of interest for analysis by the media and by all the talking heads. I found some quotes of his when he was a younger man here, which I'll link to in the show notes. I'm totally at home on the stage. That's where I live. That's where I was born. That's where I'm safe. A quote of his. And he spoke many times about how when he's performing, nobody can hurt him. He's in control, and he knows he set the parameters of the performance, so he effectively knows the size of the box that he's in. He also said, even at home, I'm lonely. I sit in my room sometimes and cry. It's so hard to make friends, and there are some things you can't talk to your parents about. I sometimes walk around the neighborhood at night just hoping to find someone to talk to, but I just end up coming home. This is a recurring theme, this loneliness theme, with a lot of delicate and sensitive and very successful and talented artists, it would seem. So the lack of a childhood, his adult childhood, shyness, extremely sensitive. He's a very sensitive young man, and that sensitivity and shyness seemed to continue, even though he became incredibly popular and famous for his performances, and yet still almost perplexingly continued to be shy and sensitive, and seemingly incorruptible by others. Even though he was an admitted victim of the wills and the extortionate handling of his agents. Both mom and dad knew that music was a way of keeping the family together in a neighborhood where gangs recruited kids my brother's ages. So he grew up with a lot of pressure. That pressure never seemed to abate, and it drove his personal psychology towards delirium and almost pathology, it would seem. So quite sad and tragic, really, when you think about how incredibly successful he was. And then, of course, he died at a very, very young age.
He wasn't very, very young. He was 50.
That's pretty young. He could have gone on. He could have gone on to his 90s.
No, he died because his 50-year-old body couldn't cope with the abuse.
Well, okay. So it's a relative term, but I think he certainly died younger than anybody was expecting.
Well, that's true. It was very sad. He was about to embark on a comeback tour, and I think all the tickets were sold out to a month-long residency at the Millennium Dome.
AKA the Millennium Tent.
And he died in some fairly shady circumstances.
Indeed. This Is It, I think the tour was unfortunately called.
Yes.
Antidepressants, anti-anxiety agents, anesthetics, a massive heart attack, probably directly related to the concentration of these toxins in his body. So, he's addicted to prescription drugs. He was not addicted to illegal pharmaceuticals, like Whitney Houston, for instance. It was prescription drugs. He seemed to need these drugs in order to conduct his daily activities, and perhaps a combination of factors led to a massive hemorrhaging of the heart muscle.
Well, about that, I was actually reading, and this is available for anyone to read, the autopsy report of Michael Jackson's death, which is very grim reading. It's in the show notes if anyone's ghoulish enough to have a read through. And what's interesting about these celebrity deaths, and Michael Jackson's no exception, is just the sheer amount of drugs that he's been prescribed. Just a crazy, insane amount of drugs. It's like just benzodiazepines alone. There's like 5 of them, or maybe 4 of them. It's like, well, what the hell kind of doctor would prescribe all those tranquilizers? But the smoking gun is this drug called propitol, which is a very powerful anesthetic, which should only be administered in a hospital by a staff of trained professionals. But yet his quack doctor was giving him this drug, this intravenous drug, at his house. And so, I remember before Michael Jackson died, there was some general sort of chatter, in the rumor mill about Michael Jackson being near death or something. And I think it's because people had actually gotten wind of just the amount of drugs that he was taking. Legitimate drugs prescribed by a physician. It's just absolutely crazy.
I mean, it strikes me as a sort of inherent problem with it's inherently linked to the fact that you can have a private doctor who is more than willing to give you whatever you want with, very faint advice to the contrary. He bought a doctor and he had whatever he wanted. He's not a doctor, and he wasn't forcefully advised against the concentrations he was applying for, and this killed him. Or perhaps, his doctor just really had no say and no power, and tried, but try as he might have, unfortunately, Michael Jackson overdosed. Who knows? But I wouldn't have thought this would have happened if he didn't have a private doctor, and he was going to his local GP or going to a hospital doctor and asking for the same density of drugs. But there we are. It certainly was drug related, and he certainly did die in 2009.
I don't know if it was entirely drug related. I mean, he was really seriously underweight. His BMI was like ridiculously low, and all these other crazy things. I mean, to me, it was clearly a combination of things. A combination of all these
absolutely.
things.
That would have had a bearing, of course.
Yeah, it was a combination of these things, and plus also, he was 50. And I think at that age, his body just can't take it anymore. He just can't take that unhealthy regime that he had going on.
Not to mention the rigorous and exhausting training, and his, he was obviously training for his performance. And Michael Jackson being Michael Jackson, he would have worked ridiculously hard for very long periods of time, perhaps without enough water, without enough food, and too many prescription drugs. It's a recipe for disaster. And as you say, given his age and the current circumstances, it was all too much. And his body just gave up.
Yes.
But for whatever reason, it's certainly very sad that he died at that age, and at 2009, when he had such young children. And his daughter, Paris Michael Catherine, she gave an interview, a very tearful interview after he died. And I was amazed that you could see her face. But, she just sang his praises, or cried his praises, and said he was a wonderful father, and, nobody could have had a better father than Michael Jackson, and there's no indication that there's any sort of animosity or any issues or problems there.
Ooh, careful. Too soon to tell.
Too soon to, well, perhaps, but, it would be nice to think that maybe he wasn't like his dad, and maybe he did a little bit better.
Yeah, he broke the cycle.
And yes, that's a great thing. So it'll be interesting to see if there's anything that subsequently comes out about his life. But there it is, 1958 to 2009, and a lot of highlights in between. So, an incredible career, a really interesting life, cut short, I reckon.
Yeah, I will say about his children, I think his kids really do look like him. There's this general cynicism in the press and just people who actually say that, they're not really his kids. I think that's crap. I think they really look like him. Have you seen photographs of his children?
I've seen a photograph of the daughter,
Right.
Paris. I haven't seen Prince Michael or Prince Michael II. But I've seen the daughter, and I wasn't particularly struck with any likeness, but then I didn't examine her face particularly. But who knows? I mean, he had all of his children with the same woman, did he not?
I don't think he
It was all
did.
his... Did he not?
No, he didn't.
Debbie Rowe.
I think
1997, son Prince Michael. 1998, daughter Paris Michael Catherine. 2002, son Prince Michael II.
I don't think they're all with the same mother.
I see. Well, we'll clarify this and publish this in the notes, of course. We'll go in the show notes, the actual facts. Well, I think that's all of our thoughts on Michael Jackson, unless you have anything else to add. I think he's a very interesting man, a very interesting performer. I still enjoy his music. My favorite song is probably Blood on the Dance Floor. They did a few other great songs, and Beat It and Billie Jean and Thriller are all fantastic as well. And I do not uncommonly listen to his music, and I'm certainly going to make an effort to listen to a few of his albums over the next couple of weeks. So you've been listening to eclecticist.co.uk. You can find all the shows and all the notes and a contact form on the webpage. If you have any ideas for topics that we could cover, or any feedback on previous shows, or anything at all, just send it along. Fill out the contact form at the bottom of the page, and we'll be very happy to read it and reply if you're so kind as to leave an email address. Our outro music today is something open source, so it's certainly not any Michael Jackson music, which is all, as we've mentioned, completely copyrighted and totally unavailable for us to use. So instead, we have Claude Debussy's Arabesque No. 1. The reasoning behind this choice is that Michael Jackson was allegedly planning to release an album of classical music. This is just before he died, and this is according to the American composer David Michael Frank. During a conversation about influences, Michael Jackson cited as firm favorites, which doesn't particularly surprise me, Aaron Copland's Rodeo, among other works of Copland, Bernstein's West Side Story, of course, and Debussy's Arabesque, and also his Clair de Lune, among others. He was a real fan of classical music, and he proved, certainly to David Michael Frank, that he was very knowledgeable on the topic. This recording is performed by Chris Bremer, and it's been made available on the Piano Society's website, which we'll link in the notes. And just to say, our next topic is going to be the BBC, that is, the British Broadcasting Corporation. Thank you very much, and good evening.